my name is Charlotte Baker, and welcome to my baking show, Baking and Books, where each week I teach you a new fun recipe and I narrate a piece of American literature that goes along with it. This week, we will be making a chocolate rocket ship cake that has a big red planet and white stars on it. And the piece of literature that goes along with this is Raymond Carver's A Small Good Thing. This is one of my favorite pieces from American literature, so let's get started. So the first step in our baking process is to gather ingredients. I've got our cake mix right here, and we have 3 eggs, which I've already gathered. Let's see, half a cup of vegetable oil, and 1 1/4 cups of water. And I'm going to start by telling the start of the story. So our story starts with a typical American family. It's Anne, Howard, and their son Scotty, who is about to turn 8 years old. And so the story starts when Anne goes to the bakery to order a cake for her son's birthday, and she wants a chocolate rocket chip cake just like the one that we're about to make today. But when she gets there, she has kind of a rough time. She's very excited about getting this birthday cake for her son, and she flips through the book and just looks at a bunch of different options for the cake. But the baker is kind of rude and isn't really conversational, and she thinks that he should be jolly because a birthday is something to be celebrated, but he's not. And so the baker basically just tells her like the simple things, and then he tells her that the cake will be ready on Monday and to come pick it up then. So the next step in our baking process is to preheat the oven to 350 degrees, which I've already done in our oven over there. And the next part of the story is where it starts to get a little bit more dramatic, like the climax starts to hit. And so Scotty, it's his birthday on Monday, and he's walking to school on his birthday, just laughing with his friends and joking around. And all of a sudden, he steps off the curb, just not looking where he's going, and he gets hit by a car. And the driver actually drives away after making sure that Scotty got up. He just leaves, and it's a hit and run. And so Scotty's friend starts to question him and ask him like what it was like to get hit by a car, and Scotty just doesn't answer the question. And his friend goes off to school, and he walks back home. But when he gets home, his mom starts to ask him, they're sitting down on the couch, like, is he really okay? And all of a sudden, his body just goes limp, and he falls to sleep. So next, we'll be adding our wet ingredients. I've got the oil right here, so I've added that in, and then the water in here as well. And so the next part in our story, the doctors just come in and reassured Anne and Howard that it's not a coma, that Scotty is going to be fine, that he'll wake up in a few hours. And so they've been there all afternoon, so Anne suggests that Howard goes home and freshens up for a little bit. And on Howard's way home, he starts thinking about his life so far and how pleasant and uneventful it's been and how he's avoided any major tragedy in their life until now. And right when he gets home, he hears the telephone ring, and he gets super nervous and thinks it's the hospital, so he rushes inside. But when he picks it up, there's a man on the other end that's telling him that a cake needs to be picked up, and Howard is just so frustrated because he doesn't know what he's talking about, that Anne actually ordered a cake, and so he yells and hangs up the phone. And then he goes to the bathroom, and the phone rings again, and he rushes to get it, but when he picks it up, there's nobody on the other end of the line. So the next part in our baking process is to crack the eggs so we can add those on. So at this point in our story, Howard decides to go back to the hospital, and when he does that, he sees that Scotty has been hooked up to an IV, and he asks Anne what the IV is, and she tells him that the doctor said that he needed some more nourishment, so they hooked him up to that. And so the parents, Anne and Howard, are still worried because Scotty hasn't woken up yet. And so then Dr. Francis and a nurse comes in, and they both check his vitals and say that he's still stable. And Dr. Francis says that he wouldn't call it a coma quite yet, but they're still going to do some more tests. And so later on that evening, a radiologist comes up to take Scotty for some more scans. And by the time the scans finish up, it's the next morning. So now I'm adding the eggs into our wet ingredients. And at this point in the story, it's been a whole day since Scotty has fallen asleep, and the parents are still worried with the lack of answers. And now I'm going to start mixing our ingredients. So at this point in the story, Anne and Howard are both growing really restless with the lack of answers that they have. And so later that day, Dr. Francis comes in and he's chatting with them, and he expresses concern that Scotty hasn't woken up as well. And so Anne asks him again, and he says at this point he would call it a coma. And he suggests that Anne go back home for a little bit because she's been there all day. But she thinks she's resistant to the idea at first, but then she thinks maybe if she goes home and just lets Scotty rest and just be with his father for a little bit, maybe he'll wake up. So now I'm just continuing to mix until all of the lumps are gone from the dry ingredients. And so at this point, Anne has decided that she's going to go home. And on her way out, she passes a family sitting in a waiting room, and they think that she's a nurse. So they ask her if she knows anything about their son Francis, who is in surgery. He was stabbed in a knife fight, and so they're really worried about their son, and she feels connected to them in some kind of strange way, that they're both experiencing the same kind of worry and pain about their children. But she continues on and goes home, and she doesn't tell them anything about Scotty, even though she feels a desire to. And so once she gets home, she hears the phone ring, and she picks up the phone and asks if it's about Scotty. And the man on the other end of the phone says, yes, it's about the Scotty problem. Have you forgotten him? And so she's really worried and stressed out, and so the man just ends up hanging up on her. And then she calls the hospital and tries to get Howard and ask him, saying that, like, a man has called and said it's about Scotty. Is Scotty still okay? And Howard says that, yes, Scotty's still sleeping, nothing has happened yet, and that she should come back at 8 tomorrow morning when she's rested and feels better, because that's when Dr. Francis is coming back. So now we're done mixing, and we're on to the next part of our story and in our baking process. We're going to spray just the bottom of the pan and coat it in a little bit of flour so it helps it come out easier. And so in our story, Anne comes into the hospital the next morning, and she's kind of occupied thinking about Franklin and his family. And so she decides to ask the nurse what happened to Franklin, because she sees that the family is gone. And so the nurse tells her that, unfortunately, Franklin passed away during the surgery last night. And so after hearing this news, she heads on to Scotty's room. And when she gets there, Howard's just kind of looking out the window, and she asks him, like, what's up and where's the doctor? And he tells her that the doctor and the neurologist just came in a little bit ago, and that they said that Scotty will need surgery because they think something else is there since he hasn't woken up yet. And so Annie gets really frustrated at Howard because he didn't call her and tell her that the doctor had already come. And while they're, like, getting mad at each other, Scotty opens his eyes, and he kind of looks around, and the parents are overjoyed seeing that Scotty has woken up. And he looks around that their faces are right in front of him, but he doesn't recognize them, and then he closes his eyes and takes his last breath. So now I'm going to pour our batter into the mold. And so at this point in the story, Scotty has just passed away, and the doctors say that he had a thing called a hidden occlusion, which they wouldn't have been able to tell until he passed away. And they called it a 1 in a million circumstance. And so Dr. Francis is really upset, and he consoles the family and just tells them how sorry he is. Now I've reached the next part in our baking process and in our story. So our cake is going to go in the oven for 30 minutes, so I'm setting the timer right now. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the oven. So at the next part in our story, Anne and Howard have just gone home, and Anne starts to call their family members and let them know that poor little Scotty has passed away. And Howard begins to clean up the toys that are around the house. And so after Anne finishes her call with her sister, she gets another phone call, and she picks up on the first ring because she's not sure who it is. And when she answers it, it's the man, and he asks her again if she's forgotten about Scotty and that he has Scotty. And she gets so mad at him, and she starts yelling at him and just calling him names. She's like, who is this, who is this? And so Howard hears her and comes in. And so he calms her down, and then they continue just going about their day. They're just really sad. And then later that evening, it pops into her mind who has been calling. And she tells Howard, she's like, it's the baker. He's been calling. I forgot about the cake that I ordered for Scotty. And so she tells Howard to drive her to the bakery. And so they get to the bakery, and they knock on the window, the front door, and they see the baker in there, and he's baking. But he either didn't hear him or saw him and just ignored them. And so they decide to go around back. And when they get around back, they start banging on the door. And finally the baker comes out, and he's like, who are you? Like, what are you doing? You don't realize it's like 4 in the morning right now. And then Anne steps up, and she says, do you realize who I am? I'm Scotty's mother, the woman who's ordered the cake, and this is Scotty's father. And so the baker gets really mad, saying that he's like, what do you want? Do you want the cake? Like, you've wasted my time. Like, I'm just not really understanding why you're here right now. After this cake is like 3 days old, nobody will want it. You might as well just take it for free. And Anne is just like yelling at him and just calling him all these names. And then she eventually tells him that the reason they haven't picked up the cake is because their son Scotty was in an accident and ended up passing away. And so at this point, the baker starts to realize, he gets really sad, and he's just so sorry. He tells them that he doesn't have any kids himself, but he can just imagine what kind of pain they're going through. Our cake right now is bubbling. It's looking really good. So I'm going to finish up the story while we're waiting. And so we're back at the bakery, and the baker is apologizing. He asks the Weisses to forgive him because he realizes that he has caused them pain with his continuing calling them and asking about Scotty. And so the baker is apologizing and just asking the Weisses to forgive him. And he says that he can't do much for them, but he just pulled some rolls out of the oven, and he can offer them some food because they look like they haven't eaten in a while. And he says that eating is a small good thing, and that is something that he can do for them. So they accept his invitation to sit down and eat. And while they're eating, the baker begins to tell them his life story. He said he had a rough patch during his middle years where he experienced some loneliness, and he's never had children or like a real family. And so they get to know his story, and the book actually says that the Weisses sit there and just nod and just listen to his story for a long time, and even to the point where they don't even feel like leaving. So that's the end of our story here today. And I just really love how even though the Weisses suffered such a big loss during the story, they really just made a new friend in the baker. So that's our cake. It's done. What? This isn't a cake. These are cinnamon rolls, just like the baker made the Weisses. Thank you guys for watching today, and tune in next week.